We're up to Daf Yud Beis here in Akdama. And we started this discussion about Chata She'ibra Shnasa, which is about the fourth paragraph down. Hainu, in the second paragraph, he says, Im hifrish chatos, shedina shetzricha lios bas shana. Let me just close the door for a second. So the din of a chatos is that it has to be up to a year old. And he points out that Tosfos has it side to say that Ibra Shnasa only applies to a chatos shedinam sheyu b'nei shnasa. Below biparim shedinam sheyu b'nei shlosha. So again, every chatos is a little bit different and it depends on the animal. But with regard to, let's say, certain animals that are brought as a chatos, the halacha is that it's only within up to the first year, from day 8 till the end of the 12 months. Now, after he was mafresh the chatos, within the year passed by, is nechleku bazeh, we're going to have a machlokes, whether or not that's enough of a reisa to give it a din of chatos shemesa. And according to one man Diomar, just like in the case of Nevda, we needed both Kipru Balel Biacheres and Nevda, and the combination of A plus B, Tarti L'Reis, so that's what generated the din of Chata Shemesa. So too here, in Ivra Shnasa, we need in addition that it was Avuda, which by the way would explain why he didn't bring it in its time, because it jumped the gun, jumped this fence, and now we don't know where to find it. L'das Reish Lakish, he says here, it's a sugya daf chav gimel, eino mesa. It doesn't have the status of a chatot shemesa. So John, we're on page Yud Beis,
okay.
And I don't know if you have it, we're in the paragraph that starts behind.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Reish Lakish is of the opinion that there's no din of chatos shemesa with regard to a chatos after the first year of its birth, of its living. And the reason for that is because here we have a classic psul, similar to mum. So we're not going to say that when the animal becomes pasul, that therefore it becomes a chatos shemesa. That we're not going to say. So that's Reish Lakish's view. So we're going to apply the general universal rule that applies to any carbon that became pasul, which is yira ad she'yitztayv, and there will be poded, and the money will fall for an idab. He says, "Eino mesa af liachar sheniskapu ba'aleh b'acheres." It's interesting. Even though he had brought a second carbon chatos to replace the first one, and that was brought on the Mizbeach, which was one of the categories in which we had a chatos shemesa, but not in this case, because there's a psul already in the carbon, and once that psul is chal on the carbon, it does not get the halach, the status of chatos shemesa. Ela roa ad she'yistayev v'yiplu damim l'nedav. The shitas Reish Lakish, Chata Shibra Shnasa Shamru Hainu Rak B'Ofen Chegam Nevda V'Kipru Ba'aleh B'Acheres. Now you'll ask me the question, according to Reish Lakish, what did the Mishnah have in mind when it listed Chata Shibra Shnasa as one of the cases of Chata Shemesa? And Reish Lakish went as far as to say that even if it was Niskapru Ba'aleh B'Acheres, nevertheless, it doesn't have the status of a chatos shemesa. So what did the Mishnah have in mind when it said that Ivra Shnasa is chatos shemesa? So the Gemara answers, Hainu bi ofen shegam nevda v'niskapru ba'aleh b'acheres. So let's say before the first year of its life, the animal jumped a gun and it's lost. He replaces it with another chatos. He was makriv and miskaper al yidei, the second string, the replacement chatos. Now you already have set in stone the two variables, the combination of which generates the din of misa. You've got both nevda and niskapru bacheres. Now of Rosh Nasa, we're not going to change the status of misa to be mafkia the din misa as a result of the fact that now it's Rosh Nasa. So in what case did Reish Lakish say that it's considered like any classic psul and it's Yirad Shiyistayv? That's a case where it was of Rosh Nasa and it's kapru ba'aleh b'cheretz, but you were missing the element of nevda. When you have nevda plus niskapru ba'aleh b'cheretz, then and only then, according to Reish Lakish, do you generate a psul of chatas hamesa, a status of chatas hamesa. Now we get to Rava. So that's Reish Lakish. Now, apparently in Rava, we have two opinions as to exactly what Rava's view was. Nechlu kurishonim im ivra shnasa. Does it automatically get a din of misa? Gamim lo nevda. Why do you need nevda? In other words, if we're already raising the status of Rosh Nasa to generate a din of misa, we don't need nevda. He's got the animal right in front of him, never lost sight of it. For whatever reason, which we don't know why he didn't bring it in its time, the year passed, first year of its life, it becomes a chata shemesa. And this is not something that everybody agrees to, but that's one view of, or one interpretation of Rava. Umikomakom ena mesa lacha shekipru balel. In other words, Rava is arguing that you need both nevda and kipru balel bacheres. He just disagrees with Reish Lakish on one point. Reish Lakish says that if it was of Rosh Nasa, then that takes it out of the category of Chata Shemesa, and therefore it's Yirad Shiyistayv. Rava says no, let it be of Rosh Nasa, let it be Lo Mesa, Lo Nevda, it never got lost, he has it right there in front of him, but it was Kipru Baleh. Now, the question that I have for you today, this is my question, is in Lo Nevda, if it wasn't lost, why is it that he brought a replacement carbon? And we're going to have to assume that since it was Ibra Shnasa, and therefore became Psul Mizbech, he had no choice other than to bring a second carbon and replace it. Normally, the replacement carbon is because the first carbon was lost. In this particular scenario of Rava, we have the first carbon. The original chatos is right there in front of his nose. But the problem is it's of Rosh Nasa. He can't bring it on the Mizbeach. That psul prevents him from bringing it as akrava. So I asked the chief his kapar for his chatos by bringing another chatos to replace it. And Rava says that's fine. The first chatos is a chatos shemesa, even though it wasn't avda. Oh, now we have a second interpretation of Rava. Shegam l'shitaso ibra shnasa eino mesa ela bavuda. That even Rava adopts the position of Reish Lakish, and he never disagreed with Reish Lakish, that if you have, number one, nevda, number two, kipru baleh bacheres, and number three was of Rosh Nasa, the of Rosh Nasa does not uproot the status of Chata Shemesa. Okay. Now, Rabosai, we begin a whole new discussion. We can make a either a shechianu or a siyum. Maybe we should bench gomel. I don't know which bracha we should recite here, but we finally finished the sugya of chatat shemes, which took us about a week. And now we're going to go through here on page Yud Beis and this following page, 14 categories of Isurei Mizbeach, 14 animals that became puzzle the Mizbeach. You can't be makriv them. And those are called Isurei Mizbeach. The Rambam has dedicated an entire section in his book of Avoda to Isurei Mizbeach. So what I'd like to do first and foremost is just read through the list of the 14 and then take it from the top and interpret each one. So we have Rovea and Nirva. That's category number one. Rovea and Nirva is categories number 1 and 2. Then we have category number 3, which is Mukta. We'll see what that means. 5 is Esnan. 6 is Kilayim. 7 is Treifa. Then we have Yotzei Dofen. We have Behema Shemisa as a Adam, that's a Shorsha Nagach. Then we have a Balmum or Balas Mum. We have a Mechusas Man. We have Eino Mina Muvchar. And we have Mechusar Ever Mibifnim. And later on, we're going to talk about a Treifa and so forth. The one, you know, when I was a child, they used to give you IQ tests. I don't know, they still have the same system. And what they did was they put 4 things in front of you, and you have to choose which one doesn't belong. You know, so you have 3 birds and an animal. You know what I mean? Here also, out of the list of 14, there's one that doesn't belong here at all. And that's the case of Eino Mina Muvchar. Well, what do you mean Eino Mina Muvchar? Okay, Eino Mina Muvchar means it's not the fattest, healthiest animal. It's not a beautiful animal that sells on the market, but it's not Pasal and Mizbeach. So that has to be understood. But let's take it from the beginning. We have Rovea as category number 1. And what does Rovea mean? But let's not make any mistake over here. It has nothing to do with mixed breeding animals. You remember that Rashi says about the Mabul, Ishchis Kol Basar, means even the animals had Ashchas from Min B'Sheino Mino. That has nothing to do with Mizbeach. Rovea means Rovea es ha'adam, which would mean that the animal had a bestiality with a female, a human female. Or category number 2 is the category of a nirva. Okay, a nirva. Once again, a nirva would be where a female animal had sodomy with a male human being. Okay, now there's one thing that I want to make a point that we left out, which is footnote number Reish Nun Zayin. It's a pretty complicated footnote, the last footnote on the bottom right here on our page. I'm going to make a note of it, if you want to make a note of it, to remind me that I'm not promising, but I would like to face that challenge of that note. But again, let's leave it for another time. Now, what is the source in the Torah for the psul of Rovea and Nirva? We open up to the 22nd chapter of Vayikra. Ki mashchasam bahem mum bam lo yeratzu lachem. Whenever you see those 2 words together, mostly in Sefer Vayikra, lo yeratzu means there's no ritzu, which is the kapara of a carbon. Kol makom shenemar hashchasa. Now we focus on a different word in the pasuk, mashchasam, hashchasa. What does that mean, hashchasa? We know that whatever fits that category of hashchasa is lo yeratzu. It's disqualified from the mizbeach. But what's hashchasa? V'eina eladvar erva. There are only 2 categories of averos that fit the description of hashchasa. Either it's avodas kochavim, and we'll soon see what the status of an animal that was designated for the mizbeach if somebody worshipped it. But now we're focused on dvar erva. What do you mean a dvar erva? What's a dvar erva in the case of an animal? The only possibility is where an animal had a relationship with a human being. That's one drasha. And now we have an alternative drasha. It says at the beginning of Vayikra, min habehema. Right? You open up the Chumash at the beginning, and the Torah says, bring a carbon, min habehema, etc., etc. And min habehema means one of behema. Obviously, that's a miyut. And the miyut is coming to exclude rovea and nirva. My mind is curious to know, but I'm going to leave this question for another time, whether there's any difference in halacha between a rovea and a nirva. I don't believe there is. But you might have said that a rovea is more of an active participant, and maybe we should put that on a more intense level of a psul. But the truth is that rovea and nirva have nothing to do with guilt at this point. It could be the animal is guilty. I'm not denying that. An animal doesn't have freedom of choice, but an animal sometimes has to be put to death because of a very dangerous aberration and violation. But here in this context, we're talking about the behemoth itself. We're not talking about its actions. We're not passing a judgment on the animal. That animal gets a status of a rovea or a nirva, and moshchasam bahem. For example, a bal mum. A bal mum is pasul mizbeach. Is that a judgmental call? Are we finding the animal guilty for swallowing a nail? It's a mitzius. It's a halachic mitzius that this animal is pasul mizbeach. Why? Because it's a bal mum. No blame. It could be a human being put a mum in the animal, but the animal is still excluded from the mizbeach. So in rovea and nirva, we're not going to make any distinctions. The mashchasam is bahem. Bahem means in the animal. Why? How? It's irrelevant, either rovea or nirva. Now we get to muktzah. What is muktzah? Muktzah is halach in Shabbos and Yontiv. What does it mean, muktzah l'mizbeach? And now we get back to the pasuk umashchasam that we started with, and we said that there are two categories that fit the description of mashchasam below yiratu. One is a dvar erva, the other is avodas kochav. So now we're on to avodas kochav. Why the word muktzah? Muktzah means designation. This animal was designated, maybe in India, and Hindus, I don't know who it was, for worship. Maybe back in ancient Egypt. Is hiktu osam for the sake of avodah zarah. Now you could have two scenarios. You could have a deity, one of their gods, and then the animal is being brought by the idolaters as part of their cult as a sacrifice to their avodah zarah. The other alternative is, as I said before, you bow down to the animal. You attribute deity to the animal. The Yesovrim Chadvarim Eno Nasa Muksa El Mishayasu Ba Maisel Avodah Zarah. Does it mean he already worshipped the animal, or it's enough that it's muktzah? And there's one opinion. I don't know if he tells you who it is. Oh, it's a Lashon Rishon in the Gemara, apparently in Rabbi Yitzchak, that Tzarech Meiser Le'osra. The Lashon Hasheni Asur Gam below Meiser. So this really touches on laws of Avodas Kochavim. For example, an animal that was used in a cult, an idolatrous cult, is Asur Ba'no. You can't get any benefit from it. Would it be enough that he designated the animal for idol worship, but he hasn't yet worshipped it or used it in a ritual? And these are two Lashonos in the Sugya. And the nafkamina is going to be whether it's possible in Mizbeach. Again, we can have another nafkamina whether or not it's asur b'hana. And I would tell you the following, that even if I grant you that it's asur b'hana, I could still accept that lishna that came into lo of the maisa. It's still kosher l'mizbeach. It might be asur b'hana, but it could be theoretically kosher l'mizbeach because it's not mushchasam b'hem. He hasn't yet done an action other than to designate. We could say even the opposite, that maybe this is a separate halachim sul mizbeach, and it's considered mashchasam b'hem because it was designated as avodah zarah. He hasn't yet worshipped it. It's not asur b'hana, but it's pasul mizbeach. And I'm inclined towards that second shot because if it's already if it's already asur b'hana, I don't believe for a minute that anyone would say you can use it as a carbon on mizbeach, because we know that anything that goes on the mizbeach has to be roy lachilas adam. It has to be edible. And if it's asur b'hana, it's not edible. And that's called mimashka b'hem min hamutar b'ficha. Okay, now we get to category number 4. We're assuming in category number 3 that designating the animal for avodah zarah is not enough to pasul it lemizbeach. Why? Because lo avda mais. But now we get to category number 4 of nevad. No, wait a second. If we're holding that it's not, no, just one second. If it's not enough that I designated it, so then we get to nevad. No. My mistake. We're talking about that the Lishna in the Gemara, that designation, which is called haktzah, is sufficient to generate a psul mizbeach. So why do I need nevad? I guess it's the case where he wasn't machzid. Let's see. Nevad sha'ovdin oso avodah zarah. Very ambiguous language. What does it mean? Sha'ovdim oso avodah zarah. I'll tell you what I think it means. This is with limited liability. I think what we're saying is the following. Muktzah applies to your animal, meaning you own the animal, and as an expression of your bailus, you can designate it for avodah zarah. And according to this lishna in the Gemara, you generate a shem muktzah, and it's pasul mizbeach. But what happens with Yenam's animal? It's not my animal. I can't designate your animal for avodah zarah. But if, let me take myself out of the picture here, Ruvain designated Shimon's animal for avodah zarah, nothing happened. That animal is still kosher l'mitzvah. But now, Ruvain went a step further and he worshipped that animal. And it's not his. Could be, I'm just throwing this out as a possibility, that that's this 4th category of nevad. Once it was nevad, it becomes pasul mizbeach, despite the fact that it's not your animal. You are worshiping your gods or your animals, and now you worship his animal. That makes it into a nevad. Do you see what my problem is? Why do we need a category of nevad if we already have muktzah? If he designated, and that in and of itself is enough to generate a psul mizbeach, why do I have to go a step further and say he worshipped it? My nafkamina. But I'm suggesting the nafkamina is whether it's your animal or his animal. If it's your animal, you have a psul muktzah. But if it's his animal, there's no psul muktzah. But in the case of nevad, that psul is chal even vis-a-vis someone else's animal. It becomes a nevad. Okay, now he goes through the drushes, again, the same two drushes that we had before with regard to Rovei and Nirva, Kimash Chasam and Mumbam, or Min HaBehema to exclude, in this case, not Min HaBehema, we already used Min HaBehema to exclude the case of Rovei and Nirva. Now we're going to use Min HaBehema to disqualify a Neva. Okay, let's just see. Maybe he'll say something here. John, you're my man for this. Do you have access to a Torah Tmima? Can I bother you with Sefer Vayikra? This is a question that the Torah Tmima has to address by definition. I hope I'm not wrong, but okay, John went to get a Torah Tmima. So how many categories? What number are we up to? 5. Number 5 out of 14. Esnan. Are we familiar with Esnan? So Esnan is payment for an active znus. You pay the zona with an animal if she so demands, or that's what you have. You don't have any cash. And since this animal was paid as schar, as wages for znus, the animal becomes an esnan, and it's posel mizbeach. We're going to derive this from a posel. So, John, if you have a Torah Tmima and you could open up to the very beginning of Vayikra, I'm hoping that this is what you'll find in the text itself before you get to the footnotes, right? In Pasuk Beis, it's going to say, Mina bakar uminat song. You have that? Okay, I have to... I don't know how it works here.
All right. I'm
okay.
Now I'm not muted.
Do you have Mina bakar uminat song? Pasuk Beis.
Yes.
So what I'm hoping you'll find is on the Mina Bakar, again, he may have a whole list of what he derives from that, but one listing should be Lahotzias HaNevad, and then Minatzon, Lahotzias HaMuktzah.
That's right. That's
so
correct.
Now, are there any footnotes on, especially the second one, Lahotzi Min HaMuktzah? Or no. You know what? I would be more interested in a footnote on Lahotzias HaNevad if he has.
No.
No footnotes, not on Nevad and not on Muktzah.
No.
Right, I'm disappointed. I mean, why do you need Nevad if you already have Muktzah? I mean, it's an obvious question. He has a separate droshim in Atzon, Lahotzi as a Nevad, or had to go around, Mina Bakar, Lahotzi as a Nevad, but you already have Minatzon, Lahotzi as a HaMuktzah. Once you've excluded Muktzah, disqualified from the Mizbech, why do you need a separate psul of Nevad? I mean, the Torah Tmima has to ask that question somewhere. All right. So what's an Esnan? Esnan is behema shenitna liachas min asuris ola bibia. Bischara. I'm not sure why he adds asuris ola bibia, Reish Samach Sayin. He's going to have a machlokas about a pnuya. Wow, this is really interesting. I never knew this. That the psul of Esnan, according to one opinion, only applies if there's some isur bia for which he's paying her wages with this animal. But a pnuya, which is not considered isur bia, let's assume she's not nida, a pnuya tahora might not be an Esnan, even though he pays her for that mice. Okay. Now we get to category number 6. And that's called a mechir. It's a barter exchange. You give me a dog, and I'll give you a sheep. I'll give you a calf, or whatever it might be. So that sheep or that calf that's given in payment for a kelev is called a mechir kelev. It's payment for a kelev. Payment for a kelev is posel mizbeach. Lefisha nemar, and both these categories are derived from the pasuk. Lo savi esnan zono mechir kelev beis Hashem elokecha chol neder ki tovas Hashem elokecha gam shneim. So, this is not politically correct in Katamon. I don't know if anyone here in our group here owns a dog. I asked for a dog for my father every single Pesach for stealing the Afikoman, and he never capitulated. I don't know, somehow in my generation, owning a dog was not recommended. I don't know. Maybe they'll come after me with a gun for saying this, but we had too many issues about owning a dog. So in any event, but the Torah seems to be, less than excited about selling your beautiful tleh for a dog, and it becomes posel mizbeach. I imagine that you'd have to square this Gemara with the Gemara in Chulin about lakelev tashlichun osa, that we take treifa and we feed it to a dog because we owe the dog a tremendous note of gratitude because lo yechlatz each keleves l'shono. You remember the night of Yitzis Mitzrayim, the klovim were very, very calm. Okay, next, kilayim. Behema abba mishnei minim. So again, we're not talking about the original mother and father, the male and female. We're talking about the next generation. And that is excluded from the Mizbeach. Now, I'm a little confused because, as I told you before, anything that you're not allowed to eat is by definition possible Mizbeach. I don't know why we need a separate category. He says, Lefisha Nemar Shar O Kesev Ashia Kol Minu Min B'fnei Atzmo Prat L'Kilayim Reish Ayin Aleph. Again, we can take a look in the Torah T'mima and see by chance if he asks this question about why we need a miyut to exclude kilayim from Mizbeach. This would be in Vayikra Perek Chaf Beis, Pasuk Chaf Zayin. So we're in the book of Leviticus, chapter 22, verse 27. And I'm curious to know if the Torah T'mima has anything to say about kilayim and why it's possible in Mizbeach. You know what? I used to have a Torah T'mima here. I wonder what I did with it. All right, we don't have time now to look for it. I got it from my bar mitzvah. I'm not going to tell you how long ago that was. So it's got to be, more than 50 years ago. 55 years ago. But I still have the Torah T'mima from my bar mitzvah. I would say to you, it's a great gift to buy a bar mitzvah boy, except that everybody has already the Torah T'mima. So today, the average bar mitzvah gets 5 sets of Torah T'mimis for gifts. Like the chas and kala, at the engagement, she gets 10 knives, to cut the challah. She could open up a store. All right. Any luck there, John, before we move on to Yavamas?
I'm still looking.
Okay, Chav Beis, Chav Zayin, right?
Chav Zayin, yeah.
Chav Beis, Chav Zayin, Shar O Kesev, sorry. The Kriya for Yontif. Achia called Minu Min Bifnei Atzmo. That's what you're looking for. All right. In the meantime, we'll take out a Gemara Yevamos.
He has a footnote. He has a footnote. Nidme, and a Rochel Sheolda Kiminez, the A Sheolda Kimin Keves, Sheinam Kilai. Ach Mimeshu Dome Lamin Acher Puzzle.
Ah, that's interesting. I don't know if he's asking our question, but he certainly is answering our question. So we're not talking about crossbreeding, but rather we're talking about a Vlad that looks like it belongs to another min. So you have a Rachel and an Eitz, and that Vlad is Puzzle Mizbeach, B'Tor's Kilayim, even though it's not Kilayim. Maybe he's answering our question. I don't know. That would be exciting. Okay, then. Let me just, go ahead, John. What else?
He has a different deal.
Okay. So let me just shift this technology business here. All right.